and welcome. Thank you for joining us for Series 2 of the Budget Series hosted by SVCN. My name is Yvonne Jimenez. My pronouns are she, her, and I am SVCN's Policy Director. Before we get started, I would love to see a quick show of hands, if possible. Please raise your hand if you've attended either of our last two budget trainings that we offered earlier this year. Can we see if there are any hands? Oh, I see some hands. Few hands. Awesome. Love to see you back again. Awesome that you came back for a little bit more. In our last series, we covered how the county and city develop their annual budgets. And if you missed those trainings, it's no worries. We're actually going to include in the chat right now links to the recordings to those trainings so that you can check those out. But today we're going to be talking at the mid-year budget process for the county. We're so happy to bring these county-focused trainings to you with the support of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. And before we begin our program, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. We welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat. We encourage you to share your name, organization, and your role. This training will be recorded and will be shared with all program registrants. So if you have to drop off, we hope you don't have to drop off, but if you do, you'll have the recording. If you have any questions, please use the raise hand function or use the chat to submit your questions throughout the program. If we don't get to you during the presentation, we'll do our best to answer your questions during the Q&A and before the end of the webinar if time permits. Our budget training will be provided today by Asn Ndiaye. From the training, we'll shift to Q&A before hearing from our guest speaker, Bob Brownstein. He'll be sharing some tips and tricks for successful mid-year budget advocacy, and then we'll wrap with some more Q&A and announcements. But before I turn it over to Asn, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that here in Santa Clara County, we are living, learning, and organizing on the ethno-historic tribal territory of the Tamian Ohlone, who are the direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and who were missionized into the missions Santa Clara, San Jose, and Dolores. Together, let's commit to educating ourselves and advocating for Indigenous peoples and communities neglected and displaced by the U.S. government and other colonial powers worldwide. We encourage you to learn more by engaging with local Indigenous-led and serving nonprofits in your community. And with that, over to you, Asn.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. So hi, and just really great to see some familiar faces and names here. If you're returning to the series from April, it's really great to see you again. If you're new, I'll just go ahead and reintroduce myself. I'm Asn Ndiaye. Some of you know me from my previous roles at Working Partnerships USA or at the City of San Jose. So for today, what I really want to do is just go into an overview of what's occurred over the past few months and how advocates can engage with county administration over the next few weeks and months to be able to set priorities. After that, we'll be hearing from Bob Brownstein, who is a budget expert bar none and a walking encyclopedia of public budgets in Santa Clara County. So I want to do first a quick reminder of budget basics. For folks who heard this in April, this will be a little bit of a retread. At its most basic, a budget is a financial plan that estimates the revenues and expenditures for a public entity. But in a larger sense, budgets are moral documents. They're a reflection of what an entity or society cares about and what it is willing to invest in. And then, of course, in the reverse, what it is unwilling to invest in. They're dependent on local conditions, but also local politics and demographics. The budgets are the way that political entities determine the ways to allocate resources. They're living and predictive documents. I'm going to hit that point a lot today, that these are living and predictive documents that change with economic conditions, and that racial, economic, and geographic equity are at the core of public budget advocacy, but it is not always centered by budget officials, elected officials, or decision makers. So now I'm going to go into an overview of what's occurred recently at the county. The final budget was adopted on June 15th. As some of you may remember, the county was expected to have a pretty significant budget deficit of $120 million. 2/3 of the deficit was addressed through the deletion of approximately 600 vacant positions. The remaining gap was addressed through changes to reserves and capital contributions. There was also an increase in the recommended budget of approximately $8 million due to the inventory budget process, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Finally, the budget was balanced fiscally, but not structurally. And so what that means is the budget was balanced fiscally by cutting back and delaying some contribution to funds. But the longer term issue remains structurally, which is that expenditures are growing faster than revenues. And then the final adopted budget will be published online on October 5th. One new thing that we saw in the budget for the first time was the inclusion of an equity tool. And I'll pass it to Yvonne to talk about that.
Thank you, Asn. Yeah, so one thing that we definitely wanted to highlight was the use of this budget equity tool. So the equity tool was developed by the county's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Belonging, or ODEB for short. It was meant to be an internal tool that was used by all of the departments to analyze the equity implications of their budget requests. And then these implications were reported in the budget. And so you can actually see an example of that language here in the slide. This is a sample taken from pretrial services who did a fabulous job at this. You can see there's the subject, service equity impact, and then a bit of language about how their work would impact community. Now, I think I might mention that you find this kind of sprinkled throughout the budget. And I say sprinkled because unfortunately not every department has taken this up. Some departments, like one you could probably guess, it starts with a sh and ends with an arif, did not include an equity analysis and just focused on some of the service impacts of their budget cuts. So this is an area of opportunity for dialogue with the departments on the importance of considering equity and the equity implications of their budget actions. It is an area that that we wanted to highlight, and it's an area that SVCN will definitely be tracking very closely, and we'll be working with ODEB to advance. So if you have any interest in that, catch up with me, check it out in the budget. It's pretty interesting.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yvonne. As I mentioned earlier, most of the budget shortfall was addressed through the deletion of vacant positions. That was about 2/3. The remainder was addressed through a mix of different strategies, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here. As you can see on this slide, the adopted budget included new information, which adjusted the estimated budget shortfall downward by about $20 million. That is, revenues came in a little bit higher than had been predicted. Therefore, it showed a little bit of a smaller deficit than had previously been estimated. So the deficit went down from 120 to about 100. To make up for the cost of the remaining shortfall, the county reduced contributions to a variety of reserve funds, as you can see here, basically between $1 and $4 million per reserve fund, and then reduced its contribution to the capital budget by about $25 million. Now, of course, that would mean that there would be a full-on reduction of $30 million, but there was a change, a positive change, which was there was also an inventory of $8 million of inventory items that I mentioned earlier. Now, inventory items, these are discretionary funds allocated by board offices. They're primarily grant requests that go to organizations around the county. This year, there was a record 198 items allocated, with most grants being between $10,000 and $200,000. So this is an inventory of the major budget changes from last year's budget. Nearly all of the program categories saw increases in their budget. The only one that really saw a reduction was the housing and homelessness programs, primarily due to a reduction in funding for permanently supportive housing. As you can see, Santa Clara Valley Healthcare saw the largest increase of 11.7%, which added up to $570 million. Behavioral health was actually included inside of the healthcare budget, also saw an increase within that larger healthcare expenditure. And then finally, other programs like children, seniors and families, and public safety also saw increases. Currently, the county is facing some pretty significant economic headwinds, and the county budget department is projecting deficits for the next 5 years. Part of the reason for this is a weakening real estate sector driven by increases in interest rates. As you know, most of the county budget comes from property taxes. There is a slow or slowing tech sector recovery as our region continues to deal with the layoffs from last year and early this year. And there's also just an overall slowing population growth throughout the county. On the positive side, our county continues to have one of the most robust economies in the nation with record low unemployment rates. I also want to highlight that we have a really strong retail sector, which really impacts our sales taxes, which helps our local agencies and governments. There was a recently newly settled labor contract with the largest unit, SEIU, which obviously meant no disruption in services. And then an increased cooperation with local governments, especially the city of San Jose, to address our homelessness and public safety crisis. So the final budget had fairly few changes to the board priorities, which were presented back at the beginning of the year. And there were very few changes from the recommended budget, as I mentioned through that table earlier. The primary changes were really to the process. There were requests by supervisors, primarily Supervisor Jimenez, for the board offices to agree to a shared definition of equity, to increase transparency, and improve community engagement when setting budget priorities. There were also a few suggestions to improve the inventory process to ensure that the process was equitable, predictable, and non-duplicative. Now I'll pass it to Yvonne to speak a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Asn. Yeah, so the issue of equity in the budget. So there was a lot of board discussion around this, as Asn mentioned, particularly around shared understanding of equity and around transparency and equity in the budget within the budget document, but also within communication from the county to the community. So we saw direction provided by Supervisor Jimenez that there should be discussion amongst her board colleagues to get to a shared definition of equity. She made a very strong point of we can't just keep dropping this term if we're not using the same definition, then what does it mean, right? And how do we reflect that in our budget? So there's supposed to be a discussion on that, we assume in October. And then the other thing, the big thing that we hope will change is there was some direction from Supervisor Ellenberg that said that there needed to be greater community engagement and voice, and that there should be like community public meetings, or that we need to do a better job. The county needs to do a better job of publishing the budget information in advance so the community can respond and comment. And so we hope that that is adopted in this budget. We may see more direction to that effect from both supervisors during the October discussion, but it's a little up in the air right now because they haven't finalized what that process will be, what that prioritization discussion is going to look like. Now, while we don't have a lot of clarity around that, I see that as an area of opportunity, right? Because if they don't know exactly how they want to do this discussion, or they don't know yet what their priorities are, that's an opportunity for us folks as advocates to share with them what the community priorities are and how we think they could adopt, these equity tools, expand on these equity tools, and gain community feedback. So I think that there are areas of opportunity. So again, two big changes that we hope, very positive big changes that we hope we see enacted in the next budget: equity definitions that are shared amongst the board, equity definitions that also are reflective of what community input is, and expanded community engagement and voice in the budget process.
Thank you, Yvonne. And now I'll talk a little bit more about how advocates can engage with the county during this mid-year budget process. The way the budget process usually works is that supervisors talk about their priorities in January. There's a mid-year budget review in February. The budget process, this is usually in the process when departments are usually putting their request in to the county executive. That usually happens from March to May, which leads to a recommended budget in May, followed by budget hearings and an adopted budget in June, which is obviously what we just went through. This year is going to be different. It's going to be different because of this expected budget shortfall. The budget priorities are actually going to be discussed at the second, most likely at the second meeting in October. So this fall then presents a number of opportunities for advocates to engage. That October session is going to be your first opportunity to publicly engage the board around your priorities. But of course, that should continue into the fall and the winter. You should be thinking about how to develop a really short-term campaign that is, over the next 6 weeks or so, as the timeline is more constrained this time, and also continue to use these public forums for engagement. So one point I'm going to be hitting a lot throughout this training, and most likely, hopefully, during the question and answer session, is that you should be thinking about how you're getting your priorities in front of decision makers right now, especially in the current budget environment. So that means developing really compelling arguments and data for board members ahead of budget meetings. That means creating a drumbeat of outside communications and validators. It means leveraging opportunities to reinforce your message and issue throughout the year, and then highlighting successes and needs in your specific area. So the mid-year review, sort of in a larger sense, is really the time when the county staff has to show its cards, right? What are the things that it got right about the current trends, and what did it get wrong? It also presents an opportunity for you as an advocate to test their assumptions and check their math. Basically, they assumed a certain amount of revenue, they assumed a certain number of expenditures, a certain number of needs for services, a certain amount of one-time funding requests, and you essentially get to check the math halfway through the year and see whether or not things are on track or off track. It also gives you a really great opportunity to engage staff about the current trajectory of revenues and expenditures. Really want to, and this is really important, especially this year since the budget was closed through vacancy management. And you want to get a sense of what have those vacancies actually looked like, and what are some of the hiring updates. You're also going to get updates on the status and approval of one-time funding requests. And then, and this is really important, especially because of this reduction in vacancies, updates on staffing and on contracting. So for the mid-year budget, you're still going to be doing the basics of budget engagement, but just on a much shorter timeline, which means that some of the strategies will need to be truncated and done either alone or more directly. Also, since the county is estimating between $140 and $170 million shortfall in the next few years, there's going to need to be a much bigger focus on protecting existing funding and programs. Another issue that I think is a little bit uncomfortable is that sort of the easy budget fixes, sort of delaying contributions to reserves, managing vacancies have now been used this year. So that could make next year's budget adjustments a lot more difficult. So in order for you to be able to have that engagement right now in this mid-year process, that's going to mean having to engage staff really early about your concerns and about your programs. It's going to mean engaging department heads as they're putting their budgets together and highlighting your priorities, engaging elected officials in a variety of public and private ways, and coalition building is still going to be really important, though, of course, a lot tougher on this timeline. And I'm going to go over each one of these categories on the next few slides. So for direct engagement, like I mentioned, there's going to be a really short board timeline. There's very few board meetings between now and the mid-year review with the holidays and vacations and so on. It's really tight timeline to schedule with these offices. So getting there early is really important. You want to refine your board asks as much as possible. Try to sort of, give them the Cliffs Notes version of what you would want. These would obviously be both written and public asks. You're leveraging the public sessions for advocacy, going to the public meetings and to the budget sessions. All community forums, the little get-togethers in the districts, really, I think, have a huge impact on how board members and supervisors are thinking about this. And then also what you want to be thinking about is how you embed now in the current process, how you want things to work in future years. So for example, thinking about how do you seed the idea for pilot programs, for revenue ideas, or for structural changes to programs. So even though I just said that coalition building is going to be really tough on this timeline, I think it still makes a lot of sense to lean into existing relationships, especially those relationships that can be validating or have better relationships with certain board offices. You still want to show up with solutions and ideas, i.e. essentially kind of find the money yourself. As much as possible. And of course, you want to make sure that if you can work with some allies who you had a long time relationship with, to have coordinated asks. But of course, it's very, very difficult to have that in this shortened timeline. In my previous training, I talked about how campaigns have 3 acts. The first act is that you have a big campaign launch where you sort of have your laundry list of, wishes and, sort of the best case scenario. And then you go through a period of escalation and compression in which you have increasing levels of activity and try to increase the amount of pressure on decision makers. And at the third act is that you essentially create a kind of an event or a crisis in which decisions have to be made, a decision-making event. This go around, we are most likely only talking about sort of the end of that campaign timeline. You're really talking about the compression and that decision-making event as much as possible, because you're trying to engage decision makers at a time in which they are under pressure to be making cuts. And so if you're really, really trying to preserve your funding and really trying to preserve your priorities, you really, really want to focus on that end of that campaign timeline. Finally, you're still going to be wanting to engage staff to get the information you need to make these strong arguments. And also, because, well, let's be real, there's a new county executive. And this is going to be a serious opportunity to assess that relationship between department heads and the county executive, but also between stakeholders like yourselves and the county just generally. You're also doing this, of course, as nonprofit partners to the county and county employees, a lot of whom are going to be feeling the brunt of these staffing reductions. And that could lead to potentially serious workload issues, not only for them, but for nonprofits as capacity and services are constrained by budget limitations. There could also be an impact to contracting and procurement, as some key employees managing and requesting contracts could be part of the staffing reductions. And with that, I will be passing it back to Yvonne.
Thank you, Asn. Thank you so much for leading us through that training. I'm sure there are many questions. Hopefully, we have some time here for Q&A on anything that Asn covered, or anything that's boiling up for you in terms of like, how do you start your advocacy for mid-year? Where should you go? Who should you be talking to? We can definitely try and answer some of those questions. So if you have questions, please raise your virtual hand. If you don't want to speak up, you can also drop your question in the chat and we will pull it from there. So I will actually kick us off with the first question that we'd received earlier. This is one from Anne. Anne had asked, are they going to quantify equity, example, percentage of the budget that goes to services for youth, or percentage for people of color, or percentage for women? I would love for them to do that. Let me just jump in and try and answer that for you. I would love for them to do that. We have not seen that in the budget yet. I don't believe that's what the equity tool was initially designed for, but it should do that, right? We should have a sense of how much of our budget is going to these direct services for our community and are directly impacting the folks that the county services are meant for, which is often our most vulnerable, right? So I think that's something that the board offices should hear. So, when we say board offices are going to have this discussion about their priorities on October 17th, if that's, a thing that you think they should consider as a priority is expanding the use of that budget equity tool and looking at the budget in a more holistic view with that tool in mind, then an email to the board would be helpful. Public comment would be helpful. We can also pass on some of that feedback to our friends at ODEB. I think that they would be happy to hear it. They are eager to expand the budget equity tool and the support that we've provided, the community, us and the community has provided to them has been very helpful there. So thank you for that question. And do we have any other hands or questions? I saw one earlier. Oh, actually I did. I saw one earlier from Kira. Kira, go ahead.
I was going to read Anne's and you got it, but I do have a question. So, this October discussion of board priorities was prompted by Susan Ellenberg. Any reflections from either of you or even folks in the audience about the comments that Supervisor Ellenberg has been making over time around transparency and budget, and kind of what we think she's expecting and what we think might get delivered?
I can start it off, and then Yvonne, if you want to chime in.
Mhm.
I think in the most diplomatic way, I think Supervisor Ellenberg has been asking county administration and county staff to be more transparent, not only with the board offices, but with the community about how some of these budget decisions are being made before they get presented to board offices. I think especially if you look at the request from her office around timing of potential issues that may be coming up as far as budget is concerned, asking for evidence of community engagement, asking for some of these documents to be published online much earlier. I think the concern is that, especially with the upcoming budget shortfall, is that some of the decisions are not being made in a way that is fully engaging decision makers and fully engaging the community. At least that's my sense based on what I've seen, based on the requests that I've seen on in the board meetings.
And just to add to that just a little bit, this issue of transparency. So Supervisor Ellenberg is very much like a good governance type leader, and so for her, okay, let me back up a little bit and give some context. The budget process, like supervisors' input and priorities on the budget process, used to happen like January, February. So by that point, there already is a developed recommended budget, essentially. Like all the department budgets are in there. Administration is already creating the recommendations. The train has already left the station. It's already partially down the track. And so the supervisors, and this conversation also happens after the mid-year discussion, right? So mid-year's handled all this stuff. There's no sense of what their priorities are. And then later on, there's a conversation from the board on their priorities. And that's something that, as a former staffer to her, I know it always really frustrated her. It just didn't make sense. And so that's where this big push is coming from, of that, like, this timeline has to shift. But that means, again, to the point of like this compressed timing for us folks, is that shifts our timing. We would have had a lot more time to meet with supervisors to talk about budget priorities and so that they knew what our community needs were. And now it's October, right? Instead of January. So that's a big shift, I would say. And she's been very vocal about also sharing models of different counties and the way that they are better than Santa Clara County at being transparent about budget changes, about impact. So we hope that we do see some of that. I wonder if, well, I don't know if they'll get too into detail in October of what that's going to look like. I think probably administration will push that back, and we'll get more of a discussion about like at least how public information looks for the budget. But I think that things are moving in the right direction, and hopefully we see a lot more in that area of transparency and community engagement.
I have another question in the chat from Gabby. Gabby, do you want to read your question?
Sure. Can y'all hear me?
Perfectly.
Yeah, so just thinking about, obviously our county is one source of support, and knowing what the budget shortfalls are going to be. Just if there's any opportunities to advocate, at the state and or federal level to get more resources to the county, and or directly, as organizations, just something I've been thinking about to kind of make up for some of these shortfalls. I'm sure they'll be experiencing something similar, but they definitely have more resources to work with. So I'm just curious, when opportunities like that come up, I would love, that to be communicated by SVCN to us to say, if you're working on X issue, there's, this state measure, or there's this thing that, could generate revenue for the county. So just kind of connecting those dots for us would be really helpful. Just because I know that, like, Susan Ellenberg, for example, is working on a child care initiative, and where she got, $10 million through ARPA. We know those funds are going away, but like, if there's other bond measures or income, generators for the county, that we can also be involved in that, because I don't want us all to be, just always thinking about just fighting for the same resources, but how do we generate new resources? So that's just I don't know, question, suggestion, and I don't know if there's anything coming up that you all know of that could do just that.
So I'll talk about the federal money first, and then I'll talk about the state money, and then if folks want to chime in a little bit about potential new local revenue. So for the federal money, I think, as you just mentioned it, you just said it, essentially, the American Rescue Plan dollars, which was sort of the thing that had been a backstop for a lot of public and local budgets, is running out. I think, actually, unless I'm mistaken, this year was the last tranche of dollars left from that fund. Federal dollars are coming into our community, or coming into different communities. Everything from the CHIPS bill, Silicon Valley obviously being one of the bigger recipients around chip manufacturing and chip research. There is also the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the Infrastructure Bill, which is going to be a pretty significant investment, I think, in the local county. And I think there's still like a huge amount of investment happening from the federal government into education, a variety of other programs. Healthcare spending is still going up. The real issue obviously is going to be around reimbursement rates, and whether or not Silicon Valley Healthcare, Santa Clara Valley Healthcare is going to be able to be, as an enterprise fund, not dependent on any resources from the general fund. And I think that's going to be one place where there could be a significant reduction in the deficit, is if Santa Clara Valley Healthcare was on a sure footing, and part of that is going to be through the reimbursement rates from the federal government. At the state level, as folks know, the state went from having $100 billion surplus to at least on the books, $30 billion deficit. Obviously, that will be addressed because the state had pretty significant reserves in place. But there is just potentially slightly less money available that is coming from the state. But there are two places where I think there's an opportunity for Santa Clara County to be part of the leading edge around making sure that that there is investment in our county. One is around public safety and improving our, especially like incarceration facilities. And then the second one is around mental health and mental health, especially crisis mental health, especially in bed or in treatment mental health, and thinking about how we can sort of leverage the state's interest in trying to address the homelessness crisis by addressing some of the substance abuse and mental health issues around our county. As far as the local revenue is concerned, I do know that there is like a little bit of a fight happening around potential regional measures, but if folks have more details on what's happening with that, feel free to chime in.
I think one area of potential opportunity as well is that we're having changes in leadership at the Board of Supervisors. So Otto Lee is pretty new, Supervisor Arenas is new, Cindy Chavez is going to be terming out, Supervisor Simidian will be terming out. So I think that there may also be opportunities to discuss sales tax increases. He's been against it for a long time. So that may be an area. And one other thing is the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, or BAFA, BAHFA, not BOFA, which is what I thought it was for a long time. BAFA is gearing up to propose a 9-county, $10 to $20 billion affordable housing bond for the November 2024 ballot. So keep an eye out for that. We'll be highlighting that issue, I'm sure, in our newsletter. So here's a little plug. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, you should, please do consider it. And then I saw in the chat, Lisa Williams says, look into CYBHI, and then she included a link. But do you want to say anything about that, Lisa?
I would just recommend folks look into it. They have another third round of funding available. It supports schooling services and behavioral health providers that are in schools to provide them with funding to support youth in the school. So I would just recommend folks check it out.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Thank you. I had received a question from Clara. Clara had asked, do we have any suggestions regarding the best way to reach out to supervisors? What should we say or share at the meetings? This might be helpful for people new to the process or who are not connected to supervisors yet. So always a good time to reach out and start developing relationships with your supervisor. Even if you don't have an immediate ask, I mean, it's usually better if you kind of do, but if you're going to introduce yourself to the supervisor, you can always request a meeting with them. You'll want to engage with them on who you are, your organization, who you serve, what your priorities are. You might want to highlight where your service areas and your priorities are in alignment with them. So it's always helpful to find that edge, right? For example, with Supervisor Simidian, one of his big pet projects was like IT, security, safety, protection for the county. That's not everyone's cup of tea, but maybe if that's an area that you focus on, he would love that, right? He has other areas of focus as well. Expanding behavioral health within the county is a big issue area for him. Supervisor Ellenberg cares about good governance, children. Gabby had mentioned the Build the Future initiative that she's spearheading. So expanding quality childcare for children is a big issue. Supervisor Chavez has always cared about housing and also about public safety issues. Supervisor Arenas, I'm not entirely sure yet, but I do know that she said she cared a lot about the equity and the community engagement. So you could start there. You just want to, kind of listen to what they're saying in the public meetings and see where you have alignment, and then you can start from there. And then if you have budget asks, right, or you have priorities that you want to make sure are protected within mid-year or looking ahead to the next year, you would definitely want to start connecting with them. So you'd reach out to their board offices, and their scheduler is usually the best way. We can try in within our chat box. We have some contacts. I'll see if my colleague Alan can pull our the supervisors' email addresses and schedulers' email addresses, and we'll drop that into the chat for you.
I think, yeah, I think Yvonne fully covered it. I think the only other thing I would add is show up to their stuff. They like county supervisor offices usually have like community forums. They have events throughout their county supervisory area. They go to almost every sort of like handshake type place. I think sort of showing your face at places and things that they care about also really helps sort of build a relationship with them, individually as in personally, and then of course also with the staff as well. Since staff I think is always under pressure to make sure that there are folks at these events.
I see a comment in the chat by Anne. You mentioned that the D1 supervisor, that supervisor at NS, has not been responsive to email and phone calls. And do we have a feeling for when they'll be more communicative? So we have felt that as well. Her office is not fully staffed up yet. And I think she is in the process of hiring more people, hopefully some people who have some county experience. She brought some folks over from the city, and I think maybe some campaign folk so there's always starting a new office, there's always a pretty steep learning curve for the supervisors. I hope that when she staffs up, she'll be more responsive, but we'll keep trying them too. But we've had kind of that same stuff. But I think a lot of it just has to do with her not having the right people in her office yet. I'm not even sure she has a scheduler yet, so that's a challenge for sure. Oh, yes. And I love Josh's response. Persistence is critical. Absolutely. Yeah, don't give up. Keep trying. Okay. And I did see Alan. Okay, Alan's comment. Yes, we'll be sure to follow up in an email at the end of this event with the contacts for folks. Do we have any other comments? I love this other comment in the chat about Supervisor Arenas doing coffee chats with Councilmember Candelas. If you know she's going to be at somebody else's event, you can totally show up. You can track her down that way too. There's no harm there. It can be his event, but you can be talking about county issues. That's fair game. Oh, Christina Yee asks, she's on the border of 3 different county districts. How can I find out whose district I'm in? I'm located at Cathedral of Faith, at Kirtner, and the 180. I will. Kira says we can help with that. Are you going to take that one, Kira?
Yep, I will. I'm guessing D6, but it could be another one.
For council district, right? But
Yep.
for county district.
Oh, for county. Oh.
So I think it's D2.
Oh, county D2. Yeah.
Yeah,
we can confirm it too.
We can confirm. There's actually a web. Yeah, there you go. Alan just got it. Thank you. Yes, from the ROV, you can look up your district. So thank you, Alan, so much for that chat link. You can look up your supervisorial district. It's always exciting when you find out that you live in like an unincorporated pocket, like I do. It's always sort of a fun little limbo space to live. Right.
I'll go ahead and just there's a comment from Lisa about looking at committees that the soups are on and getting a better sense of what their interests are. One thing I also mentioned is that a lot of the supervisors have a history, like in the sense of they were elected to other offices prior to becoming supervisors. And so I think there's a pretty strong, long track record, especially with Supervisor Jimenez, being a nearly 2-term council member in San Jose for D8. Pretty good sense, I think, of what their interests are and what their history is, and how sort of their offices run and how they govern as well. Obviously, Supervisor Chavez, also a former council member in San Jose, and I think that's true of a lot of the supervisors.
I want to uplift a comment by Josh Sello from Bill Wilson Center, who said that if your clients cover multiple districts, you should meet with all of them, which is absolutely correct. Do not limit yourself to one supervisor. You can talk to them all. Yes, and Gabby also kind of re-upped that comment in the chat and said, don't feel limited by geography with any of the supervisors. They may support any cause, and it's a lot of times more about their interests, which is, I would also say, very accurate. And sometimes causes some friction between the supervisors, actually, when they want to be engaged in an issue that's in another supervisor's district. This board tends to have they tend to be pretty friendly towards each other, so that's usually not a problem. But in the past, it has caused some friction between supervisors. So we are going to go ahead. I think we're going to close this Q&A session and turn it over to our speaker, Bob Brownstein, who has joined us. So it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Bob Brownstein, who has over 30 years of public policy experience. He currently works on health policy issues for working partnerships and is the designer of their signature healthcare achievement, the Children's Health Initiative, which made Santa Clara County the first in the nation to ensure health coverage to virtually every child. He served as the budget and policy director of the city of for the city of San Jose under Mayor Susan Hammer, and as the chief of staff to Santa Clara County Supervisor Susan Wilson. So Bob, we heard, actually, can we see? Hi, Bob. It's good to see you. Thank you for joining us. We heard during Asn's presentation that the county is facing an anticipated general fund deficit for the next year in the range of about 140 to 170 million. And that's prompted supervisors to introduce some changes to the budget process to address these shortfalls earlier. So if you can share, based on your experience, what are some ways that the county might address these shortfalls?
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Yep. Okay. Let me give you some of my very preliminary thoughts about how to respond to and think about a year in which the county is confronting significant shortfalls, which sadly do happen. I mean, in the decades that I've been involved, I've seen some periods when the county confronted truly horrific shortfalls and had to do a lot of distasteful things because there was simply no way to escape them. So the first thing is looking at projected shortfalls, and as we go into mid-year projections and prior to mid-year, the publication of the annual financial reports, is to try and get as much information as we can about the extent to which the projected problem is in fact the problem. That is the reality better than the projections or worse than the projections? And in either case, we want to know the reality more than we did, and we'll be able to know more than we did several months ago. So what are the things to be particularly paying attention to? One is obviously fund balances. The actual fund balances are never the same as the projected fund balances, and almost always higher than the projected fund balances. So you want to know what's the actual fund balance for the general fund, what's the actual fund balance for Measure A, the 8-cent sales tax, which is budgeted separately, and what are some of the fund balances in other funds, if this conceivably some way to gain access to funds other than the general fund. Then you want to see whether the major revenue projections are on track. Are they better? Are they worse? Particularly in the county's case, property taxes, which is the giant local revenue source, and because of Measure A sales taxes. In the absence of Measure A, sales taxes would be de minimis. You'll also want to pay attention to what higher levels of government are doing, because county governments are to such an enormous extent dependent on higher levels of government as opposed to cities, which depend much more on local revenues, local tax revenues. So what are the implications of whatever the state did during the past year? And what are the possible implications of things the state is thinking about doing going into the future? Those can be of enormous consequence to the county. The federal government is kind of stuck in political quicksand right now, so I don't think there's a whole lot of new stuff happening, but there's stuff that was adopted that's still trickling down. There's still questions of how much FEMA resources are going to be actually cashed in by Santa Clara County from claims they made during the pandemic. So it's important to pay attention to those as well. So, step one is to reevaluate the extent of the bad news and try and get as concrete a handle as possible on what's really happening. Okay, now suppose we do all that and it looks like it's still going to be a bad year. What are some of the things that the county has done in the past? Well, they cut vacant positions. They've already done a bunch of that. They still have other vacant positions, and they could cut more of those. They often initiate early retirement programs. That is, they encourage people to retire, people who have a lot of time in grade and are relatively higher paid, so that they can have people at less cost providing services. If they really feel pressed, they can start reducing the allocations for reserves, technology, and capital. As you know, the way Santa Clara County budgets, it treats its fund balance as a one-time revenue, and then in normal times allocates the lion's share of that, the overwhelming lion's share of that, to technology, capital, and reserves. They're projecting shortfalls going into the future, even using those fund balances. But to the extent that there are appropriations planned for technology, capital, and reserves, conceivably some of those could be reduced to fund operations. The county has a management audit team, the Harvey Rose management auditors, that always put together recommendations in terms of how to essentially save money, do more with less. In bad times, the county may take another look at some of the old recommendations that they didn't want to have to do, but they may think are worth doing now, or they may sign new work to the management auditors to try and help them deal with the problem. If it gets really bad, I mean, the last thing the county wants to do is lay anybody off. So if it gets really bad, the county may institute attrition strategies. That is, when vacancies occur, they don't fill them, even though they agree that the work needs to be done. They also can start picking at the base budget. Normally, the budget that the county deals with is not really messing with the base. It's trying to deal with hopefully augmentations to the base. But in a bad year, they can start pressuring departments to submit reduction plans of X dollars, X percentages. They can start pressing for finding out how much is being spent for and what could be reduced for things that look less essential, like consultants, travel, memberships, supplies in general. There was one year where the county essentially wrote a letter to all vendors people who are selling stuff to the county or had contracts with the county. I don't think they sent it to nonprofits, but for-profit vendors, and just said, we're in a world of hurt and we want you to reduce, even though we have a contract with you, we want you to voluntarily agree to reduce the amount of the contract by 10%. And a number of vendors agree, and not all of them by all means, but some of them did agree. And then the last thing I'll mention before we sort of open it to everyone is, what should you be doing if it looks like it's going to be a tough year and the county is starting to move in terms of these directions, and the ultimate bad set of decisions would be reductions, and could either reductions in terms of direct services the county provides or reductions in services that nonprofits provide, nonprofits that are funded by the county. So the first advice, and you may have had some of this already from Asn, is as you go into this potentially bad year, know what you really care about. Know what your priorities are ahead of time, either priorities in terms of anything you're still going to try and get added to the budget, maybe something small could still be added, and certainly priorities in terms of what you want to defend. Second, to the extent it's possible, try and form coalitions with other groups so that there's a broad base of support for trying to defend those priorities. Third, see to the extent to which you can make the case that the county spending money on what you care about, either currently or even an augmentation, actually saves money. That is, it could cost the county X, but they save X plus something. Got to be careful when you make that case. A lot of things that the county does have fixed costs and variable costs. So just because you can save some money on the variable side, it may not amount to much if there's still very heavy fixed costs. But you should still look at that. And there are things that nonprofits do that bring in revenue, and if they're expanded, could conceivably bring in more revenue. It was mentioned that one of the signature programs that I worked on was the Children's Health Initiative in Santa Clara County. Well, this Children's Health Initiative made money for the county, a lot of money for the county. It's true, it was a cost item, but the major healthcare foundations in California were so eager to see a county actually do this and generate the data that would prove that providing health insurance for children improved their well-being and health and did better in school, etc., that they poured money into Santa Clara County. Plus, when children were signed up for the Healthy Kids Initiative, it turns out that all sorts of kids who had been eligible for Medi-Cal or CHIP and hadn't been signed up, they got signed up too. So the ultimate conclusion was very, very major increases of revenue coming into the county healthcare and hospital system, despite the fact that at least initially it was an expenditure item. Third, governments, the county certainly in this category, are really reluctant to cut things and are more willing to add things if they're highly leveraged. That is, if there's many players, and so just for illustrative programs, illustrative purposes, you got program A, you're asking the county spending $5 million on it, you're asking the county not to cut it, because for every $1 million that the county puts in, the state puts in $2 million, the federal government puts in $2 million, a city puts in $500,000, and a foundation puts in $500,000. I'm just as an illustrative example. And under those circumstances, the county's a lot more likely to try and keep the program than if it's just the county's putting its money in and there isn't any leverage. associated with it. And if you're in a situation where you're trying to defend something and there isn't any leverage, maybe you can create some leverage. Maybe you can talk to some other entity and convince them that this program may go under unless they're part of the solution. That's worth doing. And then in the worst of all possible worlds, I have seen the county make very, very major cuts. I think it was the budget 2 years after Prop 13 passed, the county issued over 1,000 layoff notices and made major reductions in services provided by nonprofits as well. So that's not necessarily the case here, but it's not always Chicken Little. Sometimes local governments, particularly counties, really find themselves in such a difficult situation that they have no option other than to do what they would really not like to do, which is to make reductions. So hopefully that's at least some useful information in terms of history and in terms of things to look at. And I'd be happy to enter into dialogue with you and see if there's anything you'd like to talk about.
Actually, you mentioned that the providers should really think about what their priorities are and then begin doing some advocacy around those priorities. And can you share a little bit about maybe who in the county they should start approaching, and then timeline, when should they start doing that? And then also, I guess if you have any tips, we had a question earlier in the chat about figuring out kind of who your champions could be, identifying kind of the supervisor's priorities and alignment there. And then I think that might cover sort of figuring out your champion. If you could share a little bit more about that.
Okay, so that's a good question, and it's a tactical question. In other words, it's not a theoretical answer that the first thing you do in all cases is go to A or B. It depends on what the program is and what the circumstances are. So it may be that the first thing you want to do is not talk to anybody at the county, but start building your coalition external to the county, so that when you do talk to the county, it's not just one small group that's coming in, it's a bigger, broader coalition. If the service that you're trying to protect or add to is one that has potential support from a county department, you can start talking to the leadership of that department and see if there's ways that you can work together, or at least communicate with each other in an open way. If there's an issue where you think you have a decent chance of getting a champion on the Board of Supervisors, or you already have one, then that should be a relatively early visit. I mean, the scale of the potential problem is big enough so that probably for the highest priority, sooner rather than later is the best advice. So if you have a champion on the board, maybe the best strategy is to firm up your coalition in terms of that priority, and then meet with that champion and let that champion know that they're not going to be out there on their own, but there's a community coalition that's going to be backing them, and see if there's a way that you can all coordinate your efforts to maximize your chances of success. I mean, I think I've said this in many presentations to groups, and probably to many of you in this group. When you're talking to people at the county, either on the board or in the administration, you have to be able to answer the question about what your internal priorities are. You can't walk in there with a list of 10 things, and when they say, what's the most important one, say all 10. That's a very easy way to have them simply write you off and say, this is a group that we can't work with. We're going to talk to somebody else who knows how to develop priorities in a time when priorities are going to be essential.
We could thank you for that, Bob. If we could back up just a little bit, because you know, some folks and nonprofits, maybe they're a smaller organization, maybe they haven't done advocacy before, maybe they're not part of a coalition, but they'd like to form one or are interested in kind of coalition building. Do you have any recommendations for somebody who might be in that situation?
Okay, well, I mean, if you're all by yourself and you've never been to any real meetings or Silicon Valley Council nonprofits meetings, and you know, then and you're sort of starting from maximum isolation, I guess the first thing to do is look around and say, who else either does the kind of service that we're trying to protect or is a beneficiary of that service? And after you answer those questions, start talking to those people. And after presumably some of those conversations will be positive, and instead of being all by yourself, you'll be a small coalition, and then you can start figuring out who you can reach out to be a larger coalition, and at some point hook up with the existing coalitions like Silicon Valley Council, Nonprofits Real, or other ones. I mean, it's hard for me to think that there's anybody out there who's providing a service that's so narrow that there's really nobody else to talk to in terms of either providing it or in terms of caring about it.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. I think we've seen sometimes some of the like smaller arts nonprofits, you know, a lot of times the counties or cities will deprioritize the arts, and so
Well, the county's unlikely to prioritize the arts in a big way.
right.
But if you are an arts group, there's no reason to assume that you're alone. I mean, there's plenty of arts groups in Santa Clara County, and to the extent that they ever get support from the county, they'll all feel vulnerable correctly, and you can start communicating with them.
Thank you, Bob. Do we have or I'm going to go ahead and turn it over and open it up to folks in the chat and folks in the group who have some questions for you. And one of them, let's see. No, there's a comment just from Gabby. Those comments and observations are super helpful. Thank you, Bob.
Glad to help out.
And one of them was a comment that was sent just to me. But Mary, I'm gonna put you on blast here. She asked, is there a way that we can develop a tip sheet that collates these nuggets of wisdom? So we can't always have you around, Bob. Where do we find this information? And I see that Mary has her hand up now, so I'm going to go ahead and call on Mary to say more.
Well, I mean, you recorded this thing, didn't you? So, you know, just write it up. I did do a written speech for Silicon Valley Council on Nonprofits a couple of years ago, and Jeff Smith got all upset about it. But you probably have it on file there, and Jeff's not there anymore, so you could probably.
No, I burned it.
You burned it. Oh God, I'll have to see if I have a copy of it. But anyway, I mean, you've got the notes, and what I've said so today, I think was benign enough so that nobody's going to get bent out of shape if they see that you're circulating it.
So Bob and others know there's been a passion project, advocacy. One day I look forward to reading your memoir, Bob. But on the second, I do agree with Bob. If I would love if SVCN would have an intern or one of their fellows to just write. And I think he's prepared some wonderful feedback that can be more. We don't have to call out specific, but I've heard over and over. And if there's just like a 1 or 2 pager that has these key nuggets that are timeless, and it doesn't matter if it's the county, a city, or state, there's some really key wisdom that he shared that would be a wonderful primer for some of us. And so, and I made that private. So thank you, Yvonne, for calling it out. But I am putting back work on SVCN. So if someone we can hire an intern to do that and then share it, that would be lovely.
I love that recommendation, Mary. We do have a fellow, well, not an LSB intern who comes to us from Santa Clara University, who's going to be starting here pretty soon, and we may just have to add that to her project list. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Bob or Asn? Do you have anything that you want to reflect on further from your presentation that maybe Bob might have some insight on?
Nothing is specifically, but I know Bob likes to talk about special sources of revenue that could be potentially flexibly used. I don't know if Bob, you want to chime in on this.
Okay, so this is something that takes a lot of work to do, and I haven't done it recently in the county. I probably will be asked to since it's a bad year. But we talk a lot about the general fund, but the general fund is only a small part of all the money that actually the county deals with. There are many, many other funds, enterprise funds. People know what enterprise funds are?
We talked about it in April, but I don't think we did a definition this time around, so feel free to
Yeah.
go.
Okay, so there's enterprise funds, special revenue funds, internal service funds, a whole variety of kinds of funds, and it's conceivable, not remotely certain, but it's conceivable that there could be extra money in one of these funds, and the thing that you want to protect can use some of that money. It depends on the source of the revenue in the funds and what it is you're trying to spend it on. And it can be convoluted, like just an illustrative example. This doesn't mean that this is the case in Santa Clara County, but let's say you started to look at the internal funds in Santa Clara County and discovered that Santa Clara County had too much money in its workers' compensation fund. That is, that it had bigger reserves in its workers' compensation fund than it needed to have to be able to pay expected workers' compensation claims. Okay. Well, you found some money, but how do you get access to that money? The money in the workers' compensation fund comes from departments who are required to pay into that fund so that there's enough money to cover workers' compensation claims. So to make that useful to you, you would either have to have the share of that money that had come from a department that you're trying to protect go back to that department, or you would have to say the department you're trying to protect doesn't have to put any more money into workers' comp for a year or two because it's already over committed the money into workers' comp. There could be a fund that deals with library services, and depending on the language that determines the source of the usage of revenue from that source, could that money be used for youth services? I'm not probably at the county, less likely. In the city of San Jose, absolutely. You could take money out of the city of San Jose's library parcel tax and use it for youth services. The language is clearly broad enough, or at least a lot of kinds of youth services. So this is like laborious. You need to go through all these different kinds of funds, look at the rules in terms of the genesis of the fund. It's the source of the money that really puts the restrictions on the fund, and see if there's more money than there should be in the fund, and see if there's something that you care about that could be used for. But occasionally you hit pay dirt. It's probably worth the effort, but it's not like, it's like the 49ers. Everybody who went panning for gold didn't find it.
I thought you were talking about the Niners, the football team, but they're hitting gold right now. So really appreciate
well, even Purdy doesn't complete every pass.
Exactly, for $934,000. So, all right, thank you.
Okay, so Bob, you mentioned a little earlier that some advice that you'd given before had got us in trouble, and Kira highlighted that Jeff is gone now. He is gone now, and we think we've created a safe space here. Is there any other recommendation or advice that you would have for this group?
Well, first of all, if I thought something was useful to you, I'd tell you. I'd probably give you a preamble that you might get in trouble, but I'd tell you. The challenge here is that I think what Jeff Smith got upset about was that I was saying that the county defines its fund balance as one-time revenues, and that money could be viewed as ongoing revenue suitable for services, which is what the city of San Jose does. The city of San Jose takes its whole fund balance and budgets it as ongoing operating revenue for the next fiscal year. They've done that forever. It's never caused them any trouble. I think that's what Jeff Smith was unhappy about, maybe something else. The problem here is that the county's projections that show a shortfall show a big shortfall, including the use of the fund balance. So it doesn't do any good to say use the fund balance. They've already got it, at least numerically, in there as part of the revenues that's available to offset the problem they're facing. So the only real fund balance help that we can get is if there's an excess fund balance. I think there will be. When I say excess fund balance, I mean the difference between the actual fund balance and what they budgeted. The actual is almost always bigger than what they budgeted. But you know, the fund balance is 400 million. The excess is going to be, I don't know, 40 billion. I mean, it's not going to be anywhere near the size of the overall fund balance. But still, in a bad year, everything counts. So you want to look at those fund balances and see if there's anything available there. I mean, and then, you know, I mean, a lot of stuff's already been done. Like, I looked at the Measure A, the 8th cent sales tax allocations to see if any of that was being used for one-time stuff that could be shifted to operations, and it's overwhelmingly, in fact, I think it's all used for services now. So it's going to take work to find resources, which is not to say that it's a virtual certainty. If you put work in, you'll find some. It's going to be very hard to find a lot. Let me put it that way.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for that. And thank you for always keeping it very real with us. I appreciate that. Well, thank you so much, Bob, for being with us today and sharing your wisdom and your insights and all of that. We really appreciate it. I will definitely have to work on capturing all of those points from our recording, which I shared earlier, we will share with everyone, but I'll start making a document for Mary and everyone else. So thank you again, Bob. Before we go, I do have, oh, go ahead.
Let me just say, you know, for all of us, this is an early step in a long journey. So we'll interact again if people come up with questions, you know, and you send them to Kira or they send them to me. I'm not going to say, sorry, you missed your moment. So we'll try and see what we can do as we get through a tough year and make it as limit the damage as much as possible.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Well, definitely, if anyone has questions for Bob and they want to send them to us, we'll pass them along. We'll make sure that he gets them, that you get some follow-up to your questions. So really appreciate you being here again, Bob. And we really appreciate Asn for his training as well. Thank you so much, Asn. So again, if you have any questions, any follow-up questions, reach out to the SVCN policy team. You have all of our contacts on the screen. Take a moment to screenshot that so that way you don't lose track of us. We're always available to answer your questions. We know that we covered a lot here today, and the budget process is quite a beast. So we're in your ring to help you figure it out. And if you had questions for Bob, he's already offered, we will pass them along to Bob as well. So again, thank you so much for being here with us. We hope that you learned something new, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks.